Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to Aghadowey on another beautiful summer's evening. Nice to see you all here. Last evening we had a very enjoyable talk by George Dallas. He set the bar very high, and I have no doubt that Linde Lunney will continue on that sort of vein. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Linde, and your mum to Aghadowey. Your mum born and reared not that far down the road, so you would have roots in this locality as well. And it's a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to hearing you. And we'll just hand over now and let you have. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Linde.
Well, thank you all very much for the welcome and the invitation, and for leaving the sunshine to come in on such a lovely evening. I do appreciate an audience. Now, my talk starts with a health warning. Some parts of the paper that I'm about to give you are based on speculation, bias, prejudice, coincidences, and vague generalizations. And none of that is that well regarded by real historians of emigration, or indeed of anything else. However, I think now that we know more about 1718, there's a bit of scope for speculation and hypothesis and guesswork. So that's what you're going to get tonight. Sprinkled lightly with facts, but I'm looking at the possible reasons that lay behind decisions to leave Aghadowey. And I must say, when you see Aghadowey on a night like tonight, you would wonder what took people away across the ocean. Now, the emigration of 1718 is notable because it's the first organised emigration of families and groups that we know about that managed to get across the Atlantic and start settlements. We know for sure that people had been emigrating before that. There's no doubt about that. But this is the first organised group of people who wanted to stay together in the New World. One of the interesting things that I'm looking at in the first part of the talk is about how people knew that there was land available in New England. And there are several possible channels of communication. And this is where the speculation and the guesswork start to creep in. If there was anyone here from Maine this evening, they would know that one of the people from Garva, a man called Andrew McFadden, left Garva and went with the Dunbow people to the Maine coastline and went up the Kennebec River and called his new homestead, he called it Somerset, because he remembered Somerset on the Bann, and this place on the Kennebec River 3,000 miles away reminded him of Somerset. Now, I don't know whether Andrew McFadden or his family ever knew why Somerset, beside Coleraine, was called Somerset. And it was something I didn't know until I started looking at the history. It seems that Somerset on the Bann, which is about where Sainsbury's now is, that was called Somerset by a family called the Gorges family. G-O-R-G-E-S, not Gorgeous. They came from Batcombe Manor, which is in Somerset, in the early plantation in the 1600s. Colonel Thomas Gorges became governor of New England, 1640 to 43, and his brother, Colonel John Gorges, became MP for Londonderry, 1654, and later he was the agent for the Irish Society and tenant of the merchant tailor's estate. So presumably it was that Colonel John Gorges who gave the name Somerset to that area. And that name then went across the Atlantic to the Kennebec River. But as well as this connection between a gorgeous in New England and a gorgeous in Coleraine, there was an earlier gorgeous from that same family who was even more important in New England history. He died in 1647, and apparently he was a cousin of the father of those two men who came. One went to New England and one came to County Londonderry from Somerset. So the Somerset connection runs all the way through the history. The one who was the early governor of Maine was granted the whole of Maine by the king, and his name, he had the remarkable name of Ferdinando Gorges, which is a great name. And you just wonder if word came back through that connection about possible lands in Maine that County Londonderry people might have access to. Or maybe there were channels of information that came back through the Puritan clergymen. The people who went from here in 1718 had been in touch with a clergyman in Boston called Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather lived from 1663 to 1728. And he was an important Puritan clergyman in Boston at the time, and was involved with helping them plan and helping them get organized to come in 1718. He was in touch, we know, with the Reverend William Holmes, who went from Strabane to Martha's Vineyard. He welcomed the Reverend Boyd from McCosquin, and he encouraged the people in a town called Draycote to take MacGregor as their teacher for the winter of 1718. So Cotton Mather was very helpful to the people who were planning. Also, he had connections to Ireland and to County Londonderry. So whatever the links were, it could be that the information came back through the Mathers. I don't think that Cotton Mather ever came to Ireland, but his father, who had the equally wonderful name of Increase Mather. Increase Mather spent some years in Ireland, and he graduated in 1659 from Trinity College in Dublin. And he had been given the parish of Macrafelt in County Londonderry by the Lord Deputy in 1658, but he didn't actually take up that parish. Increase Mather's brothers, Samuel and Nathaniel Mather, both also spent time in Ireland. Samuel was a senior fellow of Trinity College from 1654 and was one of the first Puritan ministers in Dublin. He was minister of New Row congregation in Dublin. And he was the founder of that in 1660, and he died in Dublin 1671. Nathaniel Mather, these men were uncles of Cotton Mather. So you just wonder if there were connections telling people in New England that there were settlers coming from Ireland, telling the people in Ireland about the possibilities in New England. An earlier generation of the Mathers, and I can't find a source for how this one was related. There was an Oliver Mather. He was one of the first Protestant ministers in Kilrea after the Reformation. He was in residence in Kilrea in 1622, and he was in Desert Martin in 1634. So that's another connection between New England people and County Londonderry people way before we really think of the 1718 emigration. So the links go back a long way. They didn't just arise in 1718. The Reverend William Holmes is another possible source of information. He went from the Strabane area, and apparently he was known as Holmes the Meek, to distinguish him from his cousin, who was also a minister and presumably was not meek. William Holmes the Meek settled in Martha's Vineyard in 1714, and it's known that he helped plan the emigration and the resettlement of Presbyterians. However, they heard about it. In 1718, in the summertime, they packed up and left without waiting for definite offers of land. Hundreds of people from here packed up and took ship for Boston. It's generally said that there were 5 ships, but it's not quite clear how many ships there were and how many ships went when, partly because in those days some of the ships had names like the William and Mary. So you're not sure whether you're talking about 1 ship, 2 ships, or 3 ships. So it's a bit tricky to find out whether there was 5 ships, 6 ships, or 7 ships. A lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic are trying to join up the dots to see if we can remember the names of the people who left from here, the people who went to New England and founded towns. It would be wonderful if we could make connections back and forward across the Atlantic as a bridge rather than as a separating ocean. I will tell you a success which I had while I was preparing this talk, and I must admit that I just tripped over it, and probably people know about it already, but I had the fun of thinking I had discovered it. So if you know better where it came from, just keep that to yourselves, because I enjoyed finding it. I noticed a family tree on the internet of a family of McCrellis, and it said that they were in Merrimack, New Hampshire in the 1720s. And on the family tree it says, John McCrellis was married to Margaret Burnside, and it just says from Londonderry. And the names McCrellis and Burnside, as you might imagine, rang a bell, and they actually rang a very clear bell, because I remembered seeing in the Reverend Mullen's history that in 1705, Daniel McCrellis, John McCrellis, and David Burnside are hauled over the coals by the session in Aghadowey because they were in the wrong in a case about a lease. They had been trying to take over a lease that other people had paid for. So in America, the family tree says that John and Margaret McCrellis had 10 children who went with them from Aghadowey. And in that 10 children, there was a David and a Daniel, which are the same names that crop up in the family here in Aghadowey. So I am fairly confident that we can say that that McCrellis and Burnside connection were some of the people who definitely left Aghadowey. And it says the townland that Margaret Burnside came from, I think it says Ballywoolen. So of course that's a name which we can identify as a place of definite origin for a family. And once more, that's a success for local knowledge, helping people with family history from across the Atlantic. And I first got involved in researching the events of 1718 when looking at my own family history. And when I see my McMichael cousins here, I want to acknowledge that it was their gift to my father of the Reverend Mullen's book. I think in 1972, as far back as that, I think that was where I got started on the interest in 1718. It was the first time I had ever heard of it. And it was the McMichaels gave my daddy that for Christmas of 1972. So I started looking at the family names in New Hampshire and Maine and Connecticut and parts of Massachusetts. And I was absolutely staggered to see that in the early period of their histories, the names are just like the names you get round here or round Bushmills or round Ballymoney. And I realized that these people were the founding fathers of these areas in New England, and they would be our close relatives. They were our cousins and our distant second cousins and 15th cousins by now, but they're our relatives. The names are the same. And I realized that to a certain extent, we here in Ireland had, I'll say had at that time, because we haven't forgotten them now. We are remembering them. But back in the 1970s, I think we had forgotten that so many people left here. And over the centuries since, I think we have also forgotten how dreadful emigration has been for our area. It must have been a crippling economic blow to this area that so many people left. I don't know whether any of you went to the display in Dunbow where 160 cardboard cutouts are sitting in the pews as you're sitting now, and it gives you a very graphic understanding of the hole that 160 people leave when they go away. In 1718, another Presbyterian minister wrote, "There is like to be a great desolation in the northern part of this kingdom by the removal of several of our brethren to the American plantations. No less than 6 ministers have demitted their congregations, and a great number of people go with them." I'm not sure that 6 ministers were actually from congregations. Some of them may have been students or what used to be called sticket ministers, ministers who hadn't yet got a congregation. But the fact that this minister looked at his landscape and thought how much it was going to be changed is an interesting start to the discussion. In preparing the talk to see how 1718 affected the Aghadowey area, I looked at 21 Aghadowey and local townlands that are listed with their tenants in the 1660 Hearth Money Rolls and in Pike's survey of 1725. So those are sources from 1 or 2 generations before 1718 and then immediately after 1718. And there's a couple of townlands which might be in both sources, Carnroe and Dunavenny, but the forms of the place names aren't identical, so I can't be sure that those are the townlands that are meant. But out of the 21 townlands that I looked at, there are only 7 townlands in this area in which at least one surname, and that is usually only the one surname, is found in both lists for the same place. So between 1660 and 1725, the place got cleared out. There was hardly anybody who was in the same place as their ancestors had been. And of those, the townlands where there were 7 townlands with a name that stayed there throughout that time, there's Skelty, Rusky, Glasgurt, Ballyclough, Killeig, Knockadaff, Gortyclochan, and then possibly Carnroe and Dunavenny. Now, I know that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I know that you can make any number of statistical errors and historical mistakes and general bad behaviour if you count up surnames from 2 lists that were compiled for different purposes, and you're doing an even worse thing in historical terms if you assume ethnicity from surnames. As we all know, in Ireland that is fraught with difficulties. And we have to remember also that between 1660 and 1725, lots of bad things happened to ordinary people around Aghadowey. not least the Williamite Wars and the Siege of Derry. These distressing events obviously must have had effects here as well. But the fact that there are just 9 or 10 names that remain in their townlands out of over 160 surnames that were here in the hearth money rolls, I think that disappearance of so many people, and that's just the names, that's not the numbers of the people in the families. Over 65 years, 9 or 10 names stay here out of over 160. That must have been a very noticeable change to the few families who remained here. And even more noticeable, Pike's survey of 1725 says that there were 8 townlands on the ironmonger's estate which were then without tenants at all. They had been completely emptied out. 5 of these townlands I can't identify because the place names are so strangely spelled. But of the 3 that I can place, they had had tenants in the 1660s. The Aghadowey area is unusually lucky in having several estate surveys. And if we compare the state of things between 1725 and another survey 40 years later, Alsop's survey of 1765, things have settled down. I looked at 24 townlands in the 2 surveys between 1725 and 1765, and in that period, 16 out of 24 townlands keep at least 1 surname, and therefore 1 family had remained where they had started. And then if we look at a later period in Aghadowey, between the 1765 list of tenants and the 1833 tithe allotment books, which is a span of years roughly equivalent to the gap between the 1660s and 1725. If we look at that later span of years, 3 townlands have 3 surnames in both lists. 3 more townlands have 2 surnames that survive from 1765 to 1833, and 9 townlands have a name, 1 name, common to both. So in total, in that later span of years, 14 of the 17 townlands have names that carry over between that span of years. So clearly the population was more stable. There is another temporary effect on demographics between 1660 and 1725, and that's suggested by the listings in 2 townlands. In Aghadowey in 1660, 6 of the 7 inhabitants with hearths in the hearth money rolls appear to be British. At least they have British sounding names. In 1725, after the 1718 migration in Aghadowey, there are just 2 tenants who may be of British origin, but of the 9 subtenants who are listed, 6 have Irish names. Then in Glascourt in 1660, there were 2 hearths, one household belonging to the Scottish-sounding William Leggett, and then another to a man called Donaghy McAllister, who was likely Irish, although he could have been Highland Scots. If we move to the later time in 1725 in Glascourt, there were 2 McAllisters and 5 other names of Irish or Highland form. And of the 10 names that survive in the particular townlands between 1660 and 1725, 2 are Irish origin, and the third one could be Henry, which is sometimes an Irish name in origin. It's possible that when so many people of Scottish Presbyterian background left, that the land agent and the landlord was in difficulties to find tenants and was prepared for that time to take people of Irish origin to fill up the leases. It's also possible that the native Irish were less inclined to emigrate at that point, that they stayed when the Presbyterians left. Although I would say that you can see evidence that some of the native Irish emigrated along with the people of Scots origin. One of the main families in Londonderry, New Hampshire, is called McMurphy. They might have been converts to Protestantism before they went, or they might not. But I would say certainly they must have been of Irish origin originally. There's also people called Mulligan and people called Farrell who turn up living alongside the Ulster Scots people in New Hampshire in 1720. So some of the native Irish did emigrate and go along with the mainly Presbyterian group that went in 1718. Of course, some of the names that were in the area in the 1660s are still found in the area in 1725. They've moved around. They're in different townlands. But the surnames at that date are so generically Scots or Irish form and so generally common that it is a bit risky to assume that these are the same people who have stayed. It might be new incomers coming from a different origin, filling up the empty spaces in Aghadowey. There is one case where the name is sufficiently unusual to indicate that the family must have stayed in that townland, and that name is the name David Poe, spelt P-O-E. There is a David Pow, spelt P-O-W, in the 1660s hearth money roll in Aghadowey. And then in 1725, there is a David Poo, P-O-O, and a David Pow, P-O-W. So either that's one man or two cousins who are there in 1725 in tenancies in Kilcrow and in Lissackmore, townlands close to Aghadowey. So that must be the same family that has moved into the neighbouring townlands. Now, the interesting thing about that name is that the well-known poet, the American poet Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote, what did he write? Quoth the Raven. It's a poem about quoth the raven nevermore is the only line of it I remember. So he's a famous New England poet of the 19th century, and the biographers say that his grandfather was a David Poe, who was from County Londonderry. So I think Aghadowey could probably make a claim that Edgar Allan Poe is a descendant of this congregation. The David Poe, who was his grandfather, married a daughter of the Reverend Robert McBride of Ballymoney. So it doesn't take too much imagination to think that somebody from Aghadowey and somebody from Ballymoney could well have got together, but they produced a rather odd hybrid in Edgar Allan Poe, if you ever read his biography. There is another identifiable name in the hearth money rolls. My ancestor and my McMichael and Torrance cousin's ancestor was in the townland of Culnaman, and two of my first cousins still live there. I don't quite know why my ancestors stayed when so many others left with MacGregor and Woodside. However, the Aghadowey session book indicates that there were a couple of occasions in the early 1700s when Torrances were criticised or chastised by session. So, as a clan, they may not have been susceptible to the minister's persuasion, they may not have been good terms with the authorities locally. And I may as well tell you what they were chastised for. One was accused of fornication, and the other one was accused of having spread a rumour that his neighbour had the French pox, which Session thought was not becoming behaviour. So after MacGregor and so many other people left, my maternal ancestors stayed on in Aghadowey and Garva and Kilrea to experience the ongoing, lasting effects of emigrations which started in 1718. Emigration has, as you all know, if you think about it, it has continued in every generation since. Again and again and again, families have been separated by thousands of miles of ocean and later by even more miles of flat American territory. The 1718 emigrations, which so savagely hollowed out the community in Aghadowey in the first decades of the 18th century, were only the start of a long, sad story. We have lost as much as a third of every generation throughout the whole of Ulster and eventually the whole of Ireland, right up until today. Millions left to go and live and die somewhere else. The people who stayed here, the people who remained on the home farm, all of my direct ancestors on both sides of my family and all of your ancestors on both sides of your families, they lost sons, daughters, fathers, sisters, brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, nieces, neighbours, Sunday school classmates, people who sat beside them in church, people they got used to meeting when they went to the market. Friends and relatives were lost again and again and again, not just at one point in a person's life, but every few years you would feel that you had lost someone who had mattered to you. The Rankins of Lisboy in Aghadowey form a particularly clear example of this kind of loss. David Rankin emigrated from Scotland in 1685 and died in Aghadowey in 1750. He went through the siege of Derry. A lot of people from here took refuge in Derry, and the Rankins seem to have done so as well, because his sister Margaret was shot during the siege carrying food to the soldiers. Family trees of the descendants of David Rankin fill 4.5 pages in the Reverend Mullen's book. And the family trees are identified by what happened to the people that are named. And the information may not even be complete, because it seems quite likely that 2 of the Rankins went with the Reverend MacGregor, because there's a Hugh and a Samuel Rankin on the first map of Londonderry, New Hampshire, around 1720. So probably not all the Rankins are listed, but of the Rankins that are listed in that tree, who were born in Lisboy and Heathfield in the 18th and 19th centuries, 1 out of every 2 that we know about definitely emigrated. That's half of each generation, maybe more. We don't have all the details. We know that Rankins went to California, Philadelphia, Melbourne, Durham in England, Toronto in Canada, Sicily, and especially they went to St. Louis, Missouri. In 2 generations of the Rankin family, at least 9 Rankins who were born in Aghadowey ended up in St. Louis, Missouri, where they prospered. Let it not be forgotten, they definitely prospered. But what does losing half of a family do to that family? What does it do to parents to know that half their children are likely to leave home and never come back? There might be no way of knowing if they succeeded in life, or if they had children, or if they held true to their training, if they died on the voyage or died before they got on the ship. There was no way of knowing, once someone left Aghadowey, what happened to them. That is at least as bad as losing children by death. Maybe it's worse. At least if your children die young beside you, you can mourn, you know their fate, there are graves. The people who left here were lost to a fate worse than death. Archbishop Hugh Boulter, who was the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Armagh, recognised the symptoms of emigration madness for what it was when he wrote in 1728, "The humour has spread like a contagious distemper, and the people will hardly hear anybody that tries to cure them of their madness." Calculations suggest that anything from 10,000 people a year left in the 1770s. That would be from the whole of Ireland. And the numbers continued to flood out at something like that level for the rest of the 18th century. Different kinds of emigration continued through the 19th century and the 20th century and right up to today. And with all of these people went whatever capital they could raise, their skills, their energy, and their education. And now if we turn to look at what they went to. In 1718, and for many years after it, New England was a howling wilderness. The people from Aghadowey left behind a church building and a church organisation. They had schools and shops. Young men could fairly readily go to a university in Glasgow, if not in Dublin. There were merchants who had access to the wider world. The Aghadowey elders could buy remarkably large quantities of wine for communion from John Clark of Maghera. I'm talking gallons. They could readily obtain, for instance, an hourglass for the church to time the minister's sermons. And in those days, the minister had to get over the hour. That was what they wanted the hourglass for, to make sure they got value for money. There was law, there was the rule of law, there were courts that they could have recourse to for problems. There was some provision for the poor, there was charity. They had books, they had Bibles, they had fiddles. By contrast, going to New England turned out to be like going back in time, as well as going very, very far away. It was like going back to live in the Ireland of the 1600s, except with snakes and mosquitoes. New Hampshire and Maine offered nothing more, and actually probably quite a lot less, than County Londonderry in terms of resources and climate. Even 40 years later, in 1760, the settlers and their descendants were still living in poverty and misery along the Kennebec River in Maine. And this is a quotation from a traveller. The people were thinly settled along the banks of rivers, in a country which afforded a rugged and disagreeable prospect, were in general so poor that their families almost suffered for necessary food and clothing, and they lived in miserable huts which scarce afforded them shelter from the inclemency of the weather in a rigorous climate. Multitudes of children are obliged to go barefoot through the whole winter, with hardly clothes to cover their nakedness. Half the houses have no chimneys. Many people had no beds except heaps of straw, and whole families had scarce anything to subsist upon for months together, except potatoes roasted in the ashes. The people who decided not to go to America, the people who stayed in Aghadowey, they might have been better off economically. I'm not claiming definitely that they were, because I don't know enough about the economic history, but I will state definitely that the weather is better in Ireland. The climate in New England was and is so severe that apparently the families who had emigrated preserved for generations the memory of the land they had left. Even in the 19th century, the descendants in New England talked wistfully about how the Bann Valley was like a garden where peaches blossomed in March in the open air. They might have been looking back with a romantic gaze, but there are no peaches in March in New England. If people in the north of Ireland had known what their brothers and nieces and cousins were enduring in the backwoods of rocky and frozen New England, with every English Puritan after their hides, they might not have been so eager to abandon the familiar mild climate and supportive community of County Antrim and County Londonderry. And Ireland's history might have been very different. We might have stopped emigration in its tracks. Just like us here in Ireland, with the honourable exception of most academic historians and all family historians, and all of you in this room, most of us have forgotten or have never known the truth about 1718 and all subsequent emigration. Emigration is, of course, essential for the very existence of the receiving nations. Places like Canada and America, as we know them, would not exist except for emigration. So for those places, emigration, until recent events and recent changes, emigration has always been regarded as a good thing, bringing in new blood and new skills and new people. But I think we should fight against or refuse to listen to people who say to Ireland or to Scotland, "Send us your brightest and your best," because that demand is hideously unfair to the communities which have given birth to, fed, educated, trained, and supported the young people who will then be lost to their country of origin, and who will never in their turn contribute to their birth society. Even nowadays, we educate so many whose taxes are paid elsewhere. We paid school fees for my son John, and he is now paying very high taxes in Switzerland, not repaying the debt to Ireland, to his home community. It is also a constantly repeated and damaging slur on those of us who still live here. We live here because our ancestors chose not to go. If journalists and politicians and historians continually keep stating that those who leave are the brightest and the best, what does that make us? If the people with get up and go, get up and went, are we the descendants of backwards dolts living up long lanes? That's not how I think we think about ourselves. And no one ever points out the logical inconsistency that people without get up and go, who were not energetic, who did not make the right choice to emigrate, how come those backward dolts up the long lanes managed to produce the brightest and the best in the next generation? There's a logical inconsistency here. Just one more unhelpful byproduct of emigration. If you look at our people emigrating, you would also have to conclude that people of Ulster Scots origin are not naturally good at self-publicity and PR. Or by now there would be a society of 1718 emigration descendants, which would be like the Mayflower Society, which is a very influential genealogical society in America. There would be conferences and scholarships and books and study of the history of important Scots Irish towns in New England. Up until just about 10 years ago, New England has by and large forgotten the Ulster origins of so many of their towns. The Ulster Scots has faded into the background in New England. Largely, I would have to say, because they faded into Congregationalists, which is not quite a fate worse than death for Presbyterians, but it means they no longer look like Scots Irish. They became like the English origin Puritans. And even where there is knowledge about Ulster emigration to America, people who haven't thought about it or don't know much about it would associate emigration from here more with going to the Appalachian Mountains, partly because that's a more recent emigration to the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky, but also, I think, because the link to mountainy men with their moonshine and their feuds and their long guns and their coonskin caps, still speaking exactly like their 18th century ancestors, which is kind of the story that we're told about the people, the hillbillies in Tennessee. That's more picturesque and memorable than to think of our people just melting into the industrial towns in New England and, as I say, becoming Congregationalists at the end of the day. Now, in 1831, the townland of Culnaman was inhabited by 14 households of the name of Torrens, descended, one assumes, from one original Scots settler. My ancestor probably was the Hugh Torrens, who is in the Hearthmoney rolls. So that's 14 Torrens households in Culnaman. Of the remaining 46 households in the townland, at least 10 were genealogically related to the Torrenses. And many of the houses in the townland were grouped in clusters, which geographers call clachans. And it's a term which comes from Scottish settlement. But I find a very interesting quotation to describe what clachans were like for the people who lived in them. The geographer Colin Thomas, who was in the university in Coleraine, wrote, "The whole ethos of the clachan was rooted in intertwined, functioning kinship networks that permeated all facets of daily life and culture. The essence of the clachan was lack of distance between community members who were genealogically, residentially, and socially close to each other." And that's the end of the quotation. How hard it must have been for so many of these people who maybe never saw a stranger, someone that they couldn't relate to until they left for Derry or for Larne. If they had to adjust to a completely different mentality and worldview, people from such a society, permeated by kinship connections, would have had real difficulty in adjusting to a society which operated on very different social metaphysics, as, for instance, in the industrialized cities in 19th and even 20th century America. There's one of the 19th century County Antrim Weaver poets who lamented that he had to remember, once he left Ballyeaston, that not everybody he meets is an uncle of mine. So, can we try to heal the gaps that 1718 left in our communities and the splits in our families? What can we learn from the story of 1718? Well, I think if I hope for anything in this tercentenary year, I hope that we will change the way we look at emigration. Instead of focusing almost entirely on the experiences and achievements of those who left, I think we need to acknowledge the loss experienced by those who were left and the way they managed to cope with it. I would suggest that our ancestors' sense of themselves was deeply rooted in their locality in Ulster, fostered by living in clachans, in kinship networks, and quite often within a covenanted church. What might the 21st century equivalents of some of these be? Our sense of ourselves can be deepened and enriched by awareness of genealogical connections throughout a world that is made smaller by that understanding of how we are all related. DNA is bringing up many examples of how relationships stretch far and wide. We can, along with our American distant relations, participate in an imaginative return to a significant location, like coming back to Aghadowey. We can gain an understanding of the culture that our ancestors left and that they took with them. And in remembering and learning, we can share the enjoyment of such insights with other people in a real or virtual community. Nowadays, we can reach out and connect with people through email and websites in a way which would have astonished the ancestors who said goodbye at the end of the lane. I found a very useful long quotation which sums up the effects of emigration, and it's in a rather surprising source. I don't think I ever learned it at school, but maybe some of the people who are even older than me maybe learned Goldsmith's Deserted Village. The poem was published in 1770, and it is possible that it describes scenes and an area that Goldsmith himself had experienced in Ireland. He was a native of County Longford. In 1729, up to 150 Presbyterians from the congregation of Corboy in County Longford followed one of their elders, a man called Charles Clinton, to emigrate to Ulster County in New York State. So 1718 from Aghadowey. If I live long enough, I might be participating in a 1729 tercentenary in Longford. In this, what I think there is still a small Presbyterian congregation in Corboy. But the people from Corboy had a disastrous journey. It lasted 23 weeks from May to October, and more than 80 of the 150 people died at sea. That was fairly close to where Goldsmith grew up, and it was an area that he might have passed through on his way to Dublin to go to university. So he may have seen, as a young man, the desolation firsthand in Corboy. Whether or not it's about Corboy or any other Irish village, Goldsmith's poem provides a heartfelt indictment of the hollowing out of communities, as my ancestors and yours would have experienced it in Aghadowey and elsewhere. I can't express it any more strongly than Goldsmith did, and I would have to admit that he does it much more poetically. So this is a long quotation from Goldsmith's Deserted Village. Sunk are thy bars, in shapeless ruin all, and the long grass o'ertops the mouldering wall, and trembling, shrinking from the spoiler's hand, far, far away thy children leave the land. Here as I take my solitary rounds, amidst thy tangling walks and ruined grounds, and, many a year elapsed, return to view where once the cottage stood, the hawthorn grew. Remembrance wakes with all her busy train, swells at my breast, and turns the past to pain. In all my wanderings round this world of care, in all my griefs, and God has given my share, I still had hopes my latest hours to crown, amidst these humble bars to lay me down. I still had hopes, for pride attends me still, amidst the swains to show my book-learned skill. Around my fire an evening group to draw, and tell of all I felt and all I saw. But now the sounds of population fail, no cheerful murmurs fluctuate in the gale, no busy steps the grass-grown footway tread, for all the bloomy flush of life is fled. All but yon widowed solitary thing that feebly bends beside the splashy spring. She, wretched matron, forced in age for bread, to strip the brook with mantling cresses spread, to pick her wintry firewood from the thorn, to seek her nightly shed and weep till morn. She only left of all the harmless train, the sad historian of the pensive plain. To distant climes, a dreary scene, where half the convex world intrudes between. Through torrid tracts with fainting steps they go, where wild Altama murmurs to their woe. Far different there from all that charmed before, the various terrors of that horrid shore. Those blazing suns that dart a downward ray, and fiercely shed intolerable day. Those matted woods where birds forget to sing, but silent bats in drowsy clusters cling, where at each step the stranger fears to wake the rattling terrors of the vengeful snake, where crouching tigers wait their hapless prey, and savage men more murderous still than they, while oft in whirls the mad tornado flies, mingling the ravaged landscape with the skies. Far different these from every former scene, the cooling brook, the grassy vested green. Good heaven, what sorrows gloomed that parting day, that called them from their native walks away, when the poor exiles, every pleasure past, hung round their bowers, and fondly looked their last, and took a long farewell, and wished in vain for seats like these beyond the western main, and shuddering still to face the distant deep, returned and wept, and still returned to weep. Thank you. Thank you.
Linda, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk tonight. It strikes me that what you've shared with us tonight is only a fraction of your knowledge on the subject, which, ladies and gentlemen, must come from years of immersion in the topic. So we are deeply indebted to you. And if you agree, please show appreciation again. Thank you for coming tonight. You're all invited to share in provisions in the church hall immediately after this. And let's give thanks for our experience here tonight and for the provisions that have been lovingly prepared for us. Father, thank you for what we have learned tonight.